Hey everybody, welcome to week 7. Glad to be with you again. Tonight you're going to be hearing from Rob Rudd. He's another one of our deacons. I'm excited for you to get a chance again just to hear another teaching voice. I think that's one of the strengths of men's Bible study is you're not always hearing from one teacher. So I trust and pray that you'll be blessed by Rob as he brings teaching on this section of Ruth in just a moment. But before we get to that, I wanted to make one quick announcement. You may not be thinking to the spring yet, but in spring of 2021, we will be doing our next study on the life of Abraham. And I wanted to mention that to you because if you are coming to the Mosaic services this upcoming Sunday, November 1st, we're actually going to have a book there that's like a scripture journal through Genesis chapters 1 through 11. And so if you are interested in hopping in on that study of the life of Abraham, which begins in Genesis 12, that scripture journal is our gift to you. It will be a way that you can keep up your Bible reading whenever we're done with the Ruth study. But before we begin the Abraham study, we actually have almost 11 weeks exactly between when the Ruth study ends and when the Abraham study begins. And so what you could do is grab one of those scripture journals and then take 1 week per chapter of Genesis, working through the text to get you caught up on the story so far before we jump into Abraham. If you're not able to join this coming Sunday, but you want one of those, I'd be happy to get it to you. Just shoot me an email and let me know. And with all that being said, we'll jump over to Rob. Thanks, everybody.
Good evening. My name is Rob Rudd. I do serve as a deacon here at Mosaic, as Max mentioned. Honored to be with you here tonight to share with you what God has been showing me through our passage here in Ruth 4:13 through 17. A little bit about me. I have a wife, Elisa. She also serves as a deacon here at Mosaic. We have 3 kids, 6, 4, and 2. We live in the reservation, and we've lived in Richardson for about 7 years, and we are passionate about men's and women's Bible study. I just want to put all cards on the table before you tonight. A little bit about me. Growing up, I was not what you call a reader. So I wasn't the guy who enjoyed reading narratives for the fun of it, whether fiction or nonfiction. I simply was not a fan of reading in general. I was the guy that preferred the movies and the Cliff Notes when it came time for book time. And this was pretty much true of me until adulthood. And it wasn't really until someone challenged me to read a book called Crime and Punishment by a guy named Dostoevsky. I know you're all really big fans of Dostoevsky. And as I was reading Crime and Punishment, what I realized and began to come aware to me was that he was trying to convey something deeper about humanity. He was asking questions that he wanted his audience to pick up on about humanity. He wasn't simply trying to entertain his audience. And this really began to open my eyes to how I read narratives and how I read stories. But more than that, how I began to read the narratives in Scripture, particularly in the Old Testament, which has made studying the book of Ruth this semester really a blessing for me and for my family, and I pray it has been for you as well. Our section today is really short, as you probably noticed, especially compared to the last few weeks, and it can easily be read as simply a happy ending to a really nice romantic story. And while certainly it is a romantic story and it is a really happy ending, I mean, I'm sure Hallmark could make an incredible Christmas movie out of this that my wife would geek out over. What I want us to see here is that there's a lot more that the author wants us to see and to unpack in these few verses. What I really want us to focus on as we're going through the text is this primary focus, that the providence of God is exceedingly greater than the planning of men. So as we move through these final 2 scenes of our story, and this really brief genealogy here, I want us to keep our focus on that thought, that the providence of God is exceedingly greater than the planning of men. I do want to say this at the offset. Much of the past few weeks that we've been studying have been spent in longer passages where our narrator provides quite a bit of detail regarding the scenes and situations that we've been studying in the story. But the scenes that we're about to walk through, really, they're mostly just lacking in detail and leaves a lot of questions on the plate for us, right? If we're reading this as simply just a story and a narrative, there's a lot of questions that we would probably come away with. But what I want us to see is that this is on purpose by our author. If you'll remember back to week 2, really, where our story kind of began, it also was lacking in a lot of detail. And our author, what he's doing is they don't want us to get bogged down in what's missing and start focusing on questions about what's missing. But what they're trying to do is they want us to focus on the important truths that he's trying to convey about God in this passage. Now, before we jump into our text, I want to quickly recap our story for us, just to remind us of how our characters got to this point. And if you'll remember way back at the beginning, our story starts in a really dark and difficult time for the nation of Israel. And in that dark and difficult time, we meet a family from Bethlehem, Elimelech, the father and husband to Naomi, and then their two sons. And they find themselves in a desperate situation, in search of food because there's a famine in the land, and so they're forced to go sojourn in Moab. While they're in Moab, Elimelech, the father, pretty quickly passes away and leaves behind a widow and her two sons in this foreign, strange land. The sons then marry Moabite wives, but not too long after that, the sons pass away, leaving behind their widowed mother and now widowed daughters-in-law. So Naomi, the mother, urges her now widowed daughter-in-laws to return home to their family because she doesn't have any sons for them. She has no hope of providing sons that could be husbands for them. And one of the widows, Orpah, she agrees to Naomi's urging and she returns home to her family. The other daughter-in-law, Ruth, however, she reveals this amazing, unbelievable, steadfast loyalty to Naomi by declaring that wherever Naomi goes, she will go. And that Naomi's people will become her people, and that Naomi's God will become her God. So these two women make a journey and they return back home to Bethlehem, but they return empty. They have no food, they have no husbands, and they have no children. But it just so happens that they have returned at the beginning of barley harvest. And as these women discuss how they're going to get food, what they do is they decide that Ruth will go out into the fields and she will gather grain from the fields. And it just so happens that Ruth ends up in the field of a man named Boaz. What we learn is that Boaz, he's a man of character and he shows incredible generosity to Ruth through a prayer of blessing over her and by allowing her to gather in his field, which really is Boaz showing his obedience to God and his law of provision for the foreigner and for the widow. Ruth then returns from the field and tells Naomi about this man that she met and how he has blessed her. Naomi is overcome with gladness because not only is this man one of noble character, but it just so happens that he is one of Naomi's relatives and is a kinsman redeemer. Naomi is obviously overcome with joy at this news, and her and Ruth come up with a plan. Naomi convinces her to dress herself and present herself in a way that would inform Boaz that she's willing and wanting to marry. Ruth then goes to Boaz and requests for him to redeem Naomi and marry Ruth. Boaz, astonished at Ruth's character again, agrees to redeem Naomi and to marry Ruth. But he introduces a problem right here. It turns out that there's another man who is a closer relative than Boaz, who would first be given the chance to redeem Naomi and to marry Ruth. This other man first, he does agree to the idea of redeeming Naomi's inheritance in her land, but he balks at the idea of marrying Ruth, which leaves the door wide open for Boaz to redeem Naomi's property and to marry Ruth. Which brings us to our text today. So let's begin to look at our text. We'll start in verse 13 and we read, "So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife." What we're seeing here is that God's provision to Ruth in the form of a husband, where we're also seeing the provision from God to Boaz by providing him a wife. God has ultimately provided what man could not. Boaz's marriage to Ruth shows God's redemptive work among the nations, even in the Old Testament. For me, at least, I feel like a lot of times it's easy to view the Old Testament as a book about the nation of Israel, or books about the nation of Israel, primarily stories of the nation of Israel. And then we look at the New Testament, we see God's redemptive work among the nations through Christ, that he's redeeming all nations to himself. But the fact that this prominent man of Bethlehem just took a Moabite woman for his wife is going to tell us otherwise. I also love this picture that the author is painting here, because if you were with us in our Ephesians study, this is really a picture like Paul was explaining to the Ephesians about husbands and wives and Christ and the church. This is a picture of Christ and the church, that Boaz has laid down his rights, laid down everything in order to redeem these two widows. It's why Charles Spurgeon would later call Christ our great and glorious Boaz, because in the same way that Boaz has redeemed Ruth, Christ is coming to redeem us who were foreigners and strangers. Here we also see that Ruth, like I said, has been given a new identity. She's no longer a foreigner or an alien like she was in chapter 2, verse 10, or a servant as she was referred to in chapter 2, verse 13, or a maidservant like she was in chapter 3, verse 9. But she has become a member of the household of God. Again, this is just like we studied in Ephesians, where we were foreigners and strangers, but through Christ, through his redemptive work, we have been brought in and been given a new identity. Similarly, I think it's worth pointing out here that Boaz, this prominent man of Bethlehem, we can probably conclude that he was somewhat older, right? At the very least, we conclude that at least based on his reference to younger men when he was speaking to Ruth earlier in the text. And so it seems odd that he is yet to, at this point, have taken a wife. This would be strange in this culture, given how high of a priority and significance they placed on family, but not just family, but specifically heirs. They were viewed as the ultimate blessing. But here again, we see that God has provided him a bride and blessed him in a way that was far beyond what he could have conceived of. So as we move on to the second half of verse 13, we read this. And the Lord gave Ruth her conception, and she bore a son. Again, this contrasts to her previous marriage with Mahlon, where it appears that she was probably barren. So the Lord is the one who has provided for her. The Lord is the one who has given her conception. What she was unable to do previously in providing an heir, God has done through his timing and his work. This is also a fulfillment of the prayer that was prayed over Boaz in chapter 4, verse 11 through 12, where the townspeople prayed that Boaz's house would be like the house of Perez because of the offspring that the Lord provided him. This is an extremely important note to point out here, that this is only the second time that we see God intervening directly in the book of Ruth. I do want to highlight that even though it's only the second time we see God intervening directly, really, that doesn't undermine the fact that he hasn't been at work the entire time. And I think the author is highlighting the fact that God has been working throughout the entire story of Ruth, and it is him who is able to bring resolution. This is a clear demonstration of the Lord's his steadfast love, and his blessing to Naomi and to Ruth, following their obedience and faith. Again, this idea that the Lord is being faithful to those who are obedient to him and blessing them. I want to pause there because I know that many of us get nervous when we talk about God blessing for obedience and faithfulness. And we have a little bit of a right to be a little bit nervous there, but I want us to see that God is faithful to obedience. We see that clearly here in the book of Ruth, and we are saved by grace. We're kept by grace. But this book clearly lays out for us that God is faithful and obedient to those of his children that are obedient and walk in faithfulness to him. This is the same in my house, right? So my children, they're my children because they're my children. Not because if they're obedient to me or disobedient to me. They get to keep my name regardless of how they treat me. They're my children regardless. Now, when they walk in obedience, there's joy in our household and there's this peace in our household. But when they walk in disobedience, well, there's weeping and gnashing of teeth and wailing and crying, mostly from me. And so we want to see that it's true of God as well, that when we walk in obedience, there is a blessing that comes with that. The marriage scene is going to conclude here, and it's going to transition very abruptly to a birthday celebration. And again, this is on purpose. If you remember back to week 1, Max introduced this literary idea of inclusio, and we've talked about it some throughout the study. And that's what we see happening here. The author is, if you will, putting closing brackets on the story of Ruth and Boaz and their situation. And now he wants to turn our attention to the other issue at hand, which is Naomi. Her situation has not come to resolution yet. There's still an outstanding situation that needs to be resolved. And so we could move on to verses 14 and 15. And we read this. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." I want to go ahead and point out what's kind of odd and strange about this scene. It's Ruth and Boaz are not in the scene, right? So the parents, mom and dad, are now gone, which feels odd. But again, as we pointed out, I think this is on purpose. This is a celebration of a child, and it's just Naomi and these women, these neighbors. But again, as we stated, that bracket, that situation that needed to be resolved of Ruth and Boaz, the author has done that. And so now what he's turning his attention to is this Naomi's issue. And we find in this section a three-part celebration of Naomi from these women. They start out with a praise, saying, "Blessed be the Lord." And first of all, this is just an acknowledgement of what was stated by the author, that it was the Lord who brought conception. So they were saying, "Blessed be the Lord," because he is the one who would deliver this child. This is significant also since it would be acknowledging God's actions through the whole story of Naomi. Not just the birth, but again, this highlights the fact that God is working even in the ordinary, everyday circumstances of life. Even in 2020, where it feels more like we're Bill Murray stuck in Groundhog Day, right? So it's sometimes hard. Maybe Naomi didn't see it all the way through the story, but now she can rest in that and see, looking back, that God was the one that was bringing her through. And he ultimately was the one that delivered her fulfillment with this baby and this Redeemer. They then go on to say, "He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of old age." This idea is that he's going to revive her spirits. He's going to be an assurance of family heritage. This is God redeeming her loss of family from chapter 1, where she no longer had an heir. This new son is going to be her heir and restore her family heritage from what was lost. He will sustain her in her old age. This is the idea that he's going to nourish and provide her with food. So God is giving her this child that's going to take care of her in her old age and bring food to her. This is God providing nourishment. In contrast to the famine that we saw in chapter 1, which set everything into place, God is putting a resolution on this by bringing someone that can bring food and nourishment. And they conclude their blessing with what feels really most shocking to me, and probably feels most shocking to our Israelite readers, but should also be shocking to us. What the women do is they refer to Ruth as her daughter-in-law, who is more to her than 7 sons. So first of all, we need to know that 7 sons was considered the ideal Israelite family. We see that in 1 Samuel 2:5, Jeremiah 15:9, and Acts 19:14. So this ideal Israelite family is 7 sons. But what is most important for us to see here is that Ruth, a Moabite, a foreigner, a stranger, has demonstrated hesed, or steadfast love, to Israel. This is huge, right? If we look back in Leviticus 19:34, what we see there is Moses instructing Israel to love the stranger as they love themselves. So we have Israel, this called out people that God has pulled out from the nations to set apart, make holy, in order to go to the nations and declare the steadfast love of the Lord. But ultimately, and I love this, what Daniel Block says in his commentary, is that ironically, it is the stranger from Moab who shows Israelites what this means. In other words, it is this stranger, this foreigner, that's teaching Israel what it means to go and to love your neighbor as yourself. This is the same, and I can remember probably about a year, maybe 2 years ago, Lisa, my wife, coming home. She just got her hair cut. She walks in, it looks amazing. And this is not what you say to your wife when she comes home with a new dress or new haircut, anything of that nature. But what was in my mind and what should have stayed there was, how much is this going to cost? Unfortunately, the words, they came out. And in that moment, I said the wrong thing, but my son, my younger son, he was probably 3 or 4 at the time, looks up and says, "Mommy, you look beautiful." In that moment, my son has put me to shame, and he's shown me, "Dad, this is how you treat mommy. This is how you love your wife." And the same thing is happening here, that this woman of Moab is teaching Israel what it looks like to go and declare the steadfast love of the Lord to the nations. But she's doing it to Israel. We also see here that God has used the ordinary, lowly, and humble to bring about his royal kingdom. I think this is really important for us to remember, because we need to remember that God consistently uses ordinary men to accomplish his purposes, as we're going to see here in a moment. This means that you don't need to be the strongest or the smartest or have a seminary degree, but simply walk in faithful obedience to the Lord. This also again highlights God's provision of a family being greater than man's ideal family. So I don't know what your ideal was as you maybe were growing up or were in college or as a young single man and having this picture of an ideal family in your head. And maybe you're still there and you're wrestling with that. But God ultimately can provide more than what you can imagine. And when it comes to an ideal family, his provision for you is always going to be greater than what our ideals are. This is important, and I don't want to rush past this idea that God has redeemed people from every tribe for their good and his glory. And here we see God has redeemed Ruth from the nations to declare his glory to Israel, who had been called to be a blessing to the nations. That's huge. I want us to remember that and rest in that and think about that and think about what that means for us. So God is using the faithful and ordinary to advance his purposes, and as these individuals demonstrate steadfast love, they are declaring the glory of God to the nations. Another important note to make here about this child is originally we saw Boaz as this kinsman redeemer with the word is Goel, and here it's transitioned. So whereas Boaz was once the redeemer for Naomi, now what we see is this child becoming the redeemer. And this is only the second time in the Old Testament where a redeemer is not this is the only time in the Old Testament where a redeemer is not an adult. Obviously, we know that there's a time coming. This is kind of foreshadowing another time coming where the Redeemer will be a child. But this is the only time in the Old Testament where a child is the Redeemer. The text goes on and says in verse 16 that she laid him on her lap. This is common Hebrew language for both men and women of just bringing someone to their chest or to their bosom. This is a physical depiction of Naomi's now resolution. It's a complete reversal of chapter 1 for her. She became his nurse. The Hebrew translation of this word would indicate that she became the caregiver or foster mother for the child. This view also seems appropriate based on what these women, these neighbors, are about to declare about the boy and Naomi's relationship. And so, in some manner, this is a mother-son relationship, a foster mother-son relationship. In verse 17, we read that the women gave him a name. Again, the author is continuing this idea of inclusio, as the women were the ones who opened the scene when they witnessed Naomi renaming herself as Mara, saying that the Lord had dealt unkindly with her. This is the women now concluding that scene for her. And it ultimately, in my mind, when I first read it, I was going, wait a second, what dad in his right mind is going to say, yeah, you can name my child, you can name my son, my firstborn son, you get to name him. But I do think it is important to note that this is the idea of inclusio. This is the women bringing resolution to Naomi. So what did they name this boy? And this is where it becomes this idea of resolution where Naomi named herself Mara, and then the women are now saying, well, his name is Obed, one who works or serves. And so again, this picture of Naomi distressed and restless when she returned to Bethlehem and questioning God, and now these women saying, God has brought you someone to serve you, to work for you, to redeem you, to restore you. And so it's this complete picture now. This bracket is closed for Naomi with this son, Obed. The immediate context seems to imply that he was the servant of Naomi, but overarching context is going to imply also quite possibly that he's a servant to Israel and ultimately to God. I love how Robert Hubbard describes this in his commentary. He states, what we see is God's gracious care for two defenseless widows now emerging as divine guidance for the benefit of all Israel. Our section is going to end with a very brief genealogy of Obed. It states this simply: he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So everything's coming together now, right? We see that this child is ultimately going to be part of the royal genealogy, this culmination of the book. God has not only restored Naomi, but he has carried through on his covenant from Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, through a Moabite woman. I think this is important to note here, that God's royal family line has foreign blood in it. Ruth was a foreigner, but she gets to be listed in Matthew 1, that long genealogy in Matthew 1. And this shows that God's ideal family, again, his ideal family heritage, is not bound by race or nationality. This also solidifies that God's provision of a king is ultimately greater than man's ability to provide a king. I said earlier that we need to focus on the fact that we don't have to be the strongest, and that's going to be true of David, right? He was not the one that man chose, but he was the one that God chose. We've seen throughout our story a display of this idea of hesed, or steadfast love between people, but here we see God displaying his hesed to his people through the provision of King David, who, as we know, will be the line through which Christ, our Redeemer, comes, which means God has shown his steadfast love to the nations, not just to Naomi and to Ruth and to Boaz and to Israel, but he's showing his steadfast love to the nations through this love story. I like to think of it from this perspective. So we have Ruth and Boaz who have shown exceeding kindness to Naomi without question. But ultimately what we see is God. He's the one who's shown the greatest kindness to Naomi. This child that she's holding and rocking, and I would like to think singing over. I know that my grandmother sings over my children. My mother, sings over my children all the time. This child that she's holding and rocking will one day be the granddad who perhaps will hold and rock and sing to the future king of Israel, whom God would say had a heart after his own heart. His family story would no doubt be known to him, being passed down to him, and it will inform him of the hesed of the Lord, the steadfast love of the Lord. And he'll later write these words in Psalm 25, "Good and upright is the Lord, therefore he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in what is right, and teaches the humble his way. All the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness for those who keep his covenant and his testimonies." We can also see the provision of David as a greater closing bracket, if you will, on the opening scene where famine opened up everything and started everything in Israel, to the fact that David is going to provide this great harvest that's coming on the horizon. And so here's what this looked like for me as I wrestled with this text for the past few weeks and months. First of all, I was noticing all of God's working in humanity is miraculous, even in the seemingly invisible works. There are provisions that God has put in place many, many years ago, just as he did in telling Israel not to harvest all the way to the corners of their fields, which later would be a grace and provision for 2 widows. So when I find myself, or we find ourselves bogged down by the ordinary, especially in 2020, where life is disconnected and lonely and maybe mundane, I have to stop and I have to ask myself and remind myself of how have I seen God at work in the past? What are some milestones that I can look back on and say, man, God was a rock there and he's a rock now. And how will that help me moving in the midst of the ordinary? So where do I see him moving now? What are some small ways that I can say, maybe he's not parting the seas or dropping bread down from heaven, but what are some small things that I can look at and cling to and say, God is moving even in the ordinary? The second way, maybe this one's a little more difficult, is God's people are called to this hesed type of love for one another. So who in my life is God calling me to display this type of love to? Perhaps it's a foreigner or stranger, and I know we're coming up on an election and it seems like polarization is just where we're at in life for everything. Everyone's got a line drawn in the sand. You're either in my camp or you're not. If you're not in my camp, we're against each other. We're enemies. We've put up our signs. I've drawn my lines and put my stake down, and you're either with me or you're not. What the story of Ruth is telling us is that we are called to this hesed type of love regardless of camps, right? Regardless of political sides, regardless of where you stand on a certain political matter, God is calling you to go to this foreigner, to the stranger. And the foreigner or stranger may not be someone in another nation, but it might be someone down the street who has a sign in their yard that disagrees with the sign that you have in yours. That was hard for me because I know at least on my street, there's a lot of people that have different ideologies than me. And so for me to swallow some of that and say, I'm called to show this steadfast love of the Lord to them, regardless of ideology, regardless of political leanings, that's what God's calling me to do. So as we close and you go back to your group, I want you to take just a few moments. Consider the providence, consider the provision of the Lord and the faithfulness of the Lord and how he's led you this far and how he will be faithful to lead you through tomorrow. Thank y'all. I love y'all. Can't wait to see y'all soon.